one other thing that I think is really interesting about Hogan is that it was designed to predict the performance of people, not just describe how people are.
Well, Portia, I am so excited to have you here. How are you today?
I am doing well. I am excited to be here with you and talk about one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, I know you and I talked not too long ago, and I remember we got onto the topic of Hogan assessments, and I just thought this is something that so many people ask about because it's part of the selection process in some cases, and it can be really mysterious. So, why don't we start right at the deep end? And can you tell us a little bit of what exactly is the Hogan assessment for those of us who have never taken it or who haven't even heard of it?
Right. So the Hogan Assessment is a personality assessment that was designed by industrial and organizational psychologists. And I think that makes it different than a lot of the other assessments out there. For those who don't know, IO psychology is basically psychology of the workplace. So Hogan is highly psychological in nature. What's great about that is that it has the reliability and validity, so those are statistical terms, to be used legally for aspects like hiring and selection of candidates. A lot of other assessments are more subjective in nature, so they're not legally eligible to be used in the United States for hiring and selection specifically, because that could open that employer up to an employment lawsuit, right? Or a discrimination lawsuit. So that's why the Hogan assessment is one of them that is used for selection. It's actually used by 75% of Fortune 500 companies in the US for selection. So, Patricia, you kind of alluded to this. I'm sure you get asked this all the time. I do. You might have clients who've applied for a job and then they ask, how do I answer these assessment questions? And they've received these questions from a potential employer. And a lot of times those assessment questions are Hogan assessment questions, right? So I think it's obviously a great tool for selection, but employers also use the Hogan assessment for professional development. So leadership development, growth of employees in certain areas. And so, one other thing that I think is really interesting about Hogan and makes it different, and it kind of goes back to it being psychological in nature, is that it was designed to predict the performance of people, not just describe how people are.
Oh, that's going to come in real handy. We're about to really get into, what it looks like in the selection process. Because if you're here and you're listening and you've been listening to the podcast, you know that this is what we help you do. We help you to stand out in the process, and we also tell you about points at which it's helpful and not helpful to obtain certain strategies and to implement certain strategies. So before we get into that, though, I would love you to share, or love for you to share, a few of the ways in which you are the best person for us to talk to about the Hogan assessment, and then also just a little bit about what you do.
Okay, so um, I am a nerd, if no one can tell yet. So I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, and then I have a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology, which I mentioned before is psychology of the workforce. So I've done a lot of research, not only in school, but also with clients when it comes to assessments specifically. I'm certified in the Hogan assessment, but I would not call myself a quote unquote expert in the Hogan assessment. So I do want to put that disclaimer out there. I do have more expertise in other assessments like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator Assessment or the MBTI, which some people have heard of. So that's just a little bit about my knowledge and background there. But in my day job, I'm founder and CEO of Fly High Coaching, and we offer career and business services to what I call seasoned executives, ambitious professionals, and we help them to create and execute strategies based on their goals. And really, it kind of boils down to moving through that mental resistance that shows up. And so, to this whole larger conversation about assessments, a lot of times, and I'm sure you see this with your clients as well, there's mental resistance. There is something kind of going on in the background that's preventing them from getting to what they want or what they believe that they want. And so I think assessments are a great way to kind of dig into that. We've been really fortunate to have been in business for it's going to be 12 years at this point. So, we've helped thousands of clients on their career journeys. So I think that's a little bit there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So it's helpful to know that it's complex enough, right, that you need a certification to really understand how it works. And then there's different levels within that. So you can, if you have this, you listen to this conversation and at the end you think, well, I want to go through the Hogan assessment and learn about myself, then we'll give an opportunity for you to reach out to Portia at the end of today's episode. But for right now, let's get into sort of understanding the process. And that first question for me is, a company asks a candidate to take the Hogan assessment as part of the hiring process. Does the candidate typically know that it's a Hogan assessment they're taking?
No. And it might not be the Hogan, but again, like I said before, 75% of Fortune 500 companies use the Hogan. So a lot of times it is the Hogan assessment. And if not, and I've looked at other competitors, it's going to be something that is similar in that it's psychological, I should say, in nature.
Absolutely. So it's a great question because I know immediately you're going to hear this episode and you'll be like, all right, cool. The next position you go and you take an assessment, you're like, I don't know if this is what they were talking about, but that helps to clear it up quite a bit. It is the most widely used, but at the same time, the others that are competitors are going to be similar. So now, what exactly are they looking for when you take a Hogan assessment for selection purposes?
Yes. So the short answer is what they're looking for depends on the job. The Hogan assessment not only looks at subscales of how you are with your personality, but, and this is one of the reasons why it's legally eligible to be used, they have a whole database of different profiles of people who've been successful in the role that they're trying to place. So they're going to match your personality profile towards what they think is an ideal candidate, for lack of a better term. So that's one aspect in terms of what they're looking for. Now, one other thing that I think is really important to underscore when it comes to the Hogan, because this is different than most other assessments. To go back to the point of, I said Hogan, one of their facets, right, that they talk about is helping to predict success on the job. And they're looking at questions like, what does a person want? What are some methods, or how will a person get what they want? And then what might get in the way of this specific candidate or person from being successful? And so Hogan is looking at measuring your reputation. So how others see you as opposed to your identity, which is how you see yourself. So that basis of the Hogan assessment, when it comes to studying reputation, that's what other people say about you. They believe that that can be more important to your overall success in the workplace as opposed to your own personal view of yourself.
So interesting. Okay, so I was going to go in a different direction, but I'm going to ask you one more question. How accurate have you found it to be? Because it's self-report, right? So we can ask you a question of how would your friends describe you, but it's still you answering the question. How accurate have you found that to be?
I believe that the Hogan assessment is very accurate. And then, like a lot of other assessments that are psychological in nature, they have kind of like checks in the background to make sure that you're answering the questions and the prompts in an accurate way. So, you can't go down and put, like sometimes people choose the same answer for everything,
Yeah.
straight down the board, or have some kind of pattern to how they're answering the questions. That's going to come back as, kind of elevated for this person wasn't accurately taking the assessment, which you obviously do not want to do. You don't want to be flagged as looking like, not taking the assessment in a truthful way. So that can be, I think, worse than just any type of answer that you think might not be deemed as ideal for that role.
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting. Okay, before we get a little bit deeper, what are the kinds of roles and industries that you see use Hogan or rely on Hogan more so? I think there's sometimes maybe industries or sectors or sizes of businesses that do and don't.
Yes. I think one of the most common industries that I've seen use the Hogan assessment is just different types of customer service roles. Definitely remote, but customer service, customer support types of positions. A lot of times they're using the Hogan assessment there. Another common one is sales roles.
Mm.
Um, there's some really good data about sales profiles in the Hogan. So a lot of companies can use the Hogan assessment for sales and then also for executive roles. So it's very common that high stakes roles, and by high stakes, I mean a lot of times executive VP level roles and up, um, whether it be the organization itself or an executive recruiting firm or executive search consulting firm might
Mhm.
use an assessment like the Hogan when a company has really gotten it down to maybe their top 3 candidates for an executive role. And then they use the Hogan to help them find out more about, the person's reputation, their personality, but also their values. So there's a component, we haven't dug into this yet, but there's a values component to the Hogan as well. So you can look for, as a company, individuals who have similar values naturally to your company.
Mhm. Oh, I love this. So essentially, it sounds like from you describing, right, executives, customer service, sales, it sounds like it's an opportunity to understand the intangibles and understand emotional intelligence and those tendencies, right? And I know that emotional intelligence is sort of like you can have high emotion intelligence, low emotion intelligence, and you can be strong in different areas. But do you see the Hogan, or from your experience, it sounds to me like the Hogan is similar to the MBTI in that, not in everything, only in that everybody is different and there's no right or wrong answer. It's more of, is this a good fit?
Exactly. Exactly right. There are no good or bad personality types. There are no good or bad personality profiles. What y- someone might say from a Hogan perspective is there's someone who's a more ideal fit for the role based
Mhm.
on their data and past people who've been successful in other profiles of the role versus someone else. So yes, that's completely right.
What are your thoughts? And I know that you alluded to getting into the different components, and that's where we're going to go next. But what are your thoughts on people who are outliers? I know when you and I had a conversation, you had mentioned, right, a
Yes.
story. And so, what are your thoughts on that, on someone who's like, I'm not typically someone who is viewed as the quintessential salesperson or whatever? For example, is like the whole extrovert introvert situation where people think you have to be extroverted to be in sales, but really introverts do extremely well in sales, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, that I think that's the biggest question that people ask me. And I think a good example of that, right? So prior to starting this business, I never thought I would be in sales, never thought I would have my own business. I went to work one day and was voluntold that I was going on a sales call. And I ended up in sales and ended up having a successful sales career, selling millions of dollars worth of revenue services for a company. But I am not the prototypical salesperson. I'm an introvert. And when it comes to different profiles, there are different what they call scales and subscales within the Hogan assessment, for example. So these are like just different aspects to personality that the assessment looks at that do kind of lead towards extroversion or introversion. They don't call them that within the Hogan, but they are looking at those dimensions. So that does exist. And for the sales profile, generally, they are looking for people who are more open to certain things. So now, what do you do if your personality you think is not necessarily a good fit for what they're ideally looking for? I've seen clients do different things. I have the understanding that if I was an introvert going in for a sales role and taking an assessment, I would know that if I answered the assessment truthfully, there are some dimensions of it that I might not come back as a high fit or the ideal fit for the role. So then it's on you as the candidate, right? I generally think that self reporting in an honest and truthful way is a good way to go, even though I might know that it's not
Mhm.
going to put me as the highest candidate in terms of just ideal fit. However, I've had other clients feel strongly about, answering questions on a continuum, right? And so that is their choice. What I think is important to know is that most companies are using the Hogan Assessment as one of their selection data points. They're generally not putting all of the emphasis on the Hogan Assessment, especially for sales, because it's a little more involved. I think you have a better chance at selling yourself in an interview and talking about your, what I like to call points of distinction, and how you can bring value to that organization. You generally have more of a chance to do that in a sales role and in an executive role. However, if it's customer service, I had one client where she was applying for like kind of part-time jobs and then full-time jobs. And she was applying for a part-time kind of customer service job that she was like, this can just help me to kind of get from point A to point B, right? She wasn't, relying on that to be her long-term job, but she took the assessment, took it truthfully. She was an introvert and she did not get an interview. And I think that, some of these larger organizations where it's just they're looking for volume, they might put more emphasis on the assessment and the profile fit.
Oh, wow. So this is so interesting. And I assume that each employer has the ability to put the assessment on the front end or to put it a little bit deeper in the process, right?
Exactly.
And so this is where it's interesting. You had this conversation about, well, it's on each individual person if they want to answer on a continuum. And, one of the conversations that we always have is about the integrity of your brand, right? We're talking about literally this is an assessment on your reputation. So it's very like meta here, right? So we're talking about the integrity of your brand, and you can stay and keep the integrity of your brand and speak honestly and in fact make yourself more competitive. And I think this is some more where the brand comes in. For example, when a speaker goes and speaks at an event, one thing that you can do is frame. I used to know someone who was he was a teacher from Kentucky. His name is Shane Sams, if you want to check out his podcast. But when I saw him speak, he was like, listen, I have this twang, I have this accent, and I'm a teacher from Kentucky, and I'm wearing a t-shirt. And if that bothers you, you're going to miss out on all this value. And then he starts talking. And so the way he framed it, he took what typically would be something that would take him out of the game, and he turned it into part of his unique value proposition. And so this is where in branding, you can say, okay, I know that I'm in an executive role. I know that I'm in a sales role that I'm looking for. And I know I'm not going to meet this typical framework. So how about I make this a part of my brand from the very beginning, whether it's my, interview answers, even better if it's in your resume, in your LinkedIn, right? And so I love how you brought that up, that, yeah, we all have choices to make. And then it just opened up that conversation that you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have a specific personality type, whether that's extrovert, introvert, whatever the personality type is, and be amazing at your job and still be able to move through the selection process with integrity. So I appreciate you sharing that. But earlier, you were talking about the components. I'm just going to leave this very, very open. Tell us more, and just we'll see where the most interesting parts come, because you know more of this than I do. And so I'm just going to just tell us more.
Got it. So within the Hogan Assessment, there are technically three different assessments, kind of like sub-assessments within it. The first is the Hogan Personality Inventory, or the HPI assessment. And people tend to think of this as the bright side of your personality. So these are the everyday characteristics that can influence someone's ability to get along with others and achieve their goals. So this is a prediction of how you behave at your best. The second assessment within the Hogan is the Hogan Development Survey, or the HDS. And this explores what they call the dark side of your personality. So these are unconscious tendencies that emerge under stress or pressure. These are things that can limit you and your career potential. Some people think of this as their weaknesses. The HDS predicts how you behave when you don't self-manage or are under stress. And then finally, there's the third assessment, and this is the Motives, Values, Preferences Inventory, or the MVPI. And this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, and that it evaluates what they call the inside of your personality. So these are your motives, your values, and then also unconscious biases that determine the kinds of jobs and work environments that people succeed in. Motives and values tend to define your personal goals and objectives. A lot of people think of the MVPI scales as the measure of your concern of core values. And this can be really important for determining your levels of career satisfaction in a specific role. So, for example, there are career report like resources that you can get with Hogan, and a lot of times they're looking at the MVPI, right? The motives, values, and preferences inventory. And then when I was alluding to earlier about a lot of executive roles, again, they're looking at that MVPI to see, hey, as an organization, we have these values, these goals. Does that match up with how this person is at their essence?
So interesting. And so when a candidate takes a Hogan, are they by standard taking all three of those components, or is it possible that one might take one versus another?
Great question. So, when facilitating the Hogan assessment, it's up to the organization. So, it depends on what Hogan report they're looking for and generally what type of profile they're looking for. So, someone might take all three of those assessments, someone might just take one or two of the three. And so, again, it depends on the specific goals that an organization has. You can kind of tell by the time. So, each one takes about 15 minutes. So, if they say, hey, this assessment could take 45 minutes to an hour, you're probably taking all three. If they say, hey, this assessment will take about 15 to 20 minutes, they might just be giving you one of the assessments.
Interesting. So I know sometimes I can ask questions, and I think it's all of us, right? We can ask questions that are very much like, how do we game the system? How do we know what's going right? But on the flip side of that is, you know, taking this assessment in a perfect world, right? What it's intended to do is to find a really good fit. So, what are your thoughts, or what would you share with folks who maybe right now feel like they have to have like a right or wrong answer? How can this be turned from, if I don't do well on this, I'm using air quotes, if I don't do well on this and I won't get the job, how can we turn that mentally from that to a place of curiosity, or a place of, being able to just, let me just do my best and we're going to be good with that?
Yeah, I think that it really goes back to your point before in terms of how you're looking at your job search and how you're presenting yourself, right? So I think, especially in today's job market, most people have a lot of pressure on themselves. If you're looking for a job, everyone knows how competitive it is. And, everyone has their own story and their background with how long they've been trying to find a position. Um, I think the key is really thinking about that fit. And it's reframing the opportunity to realize that you're interviewing potential companies as well. You're looking for a good fit for yourself as far as a job with roles and responsibilities, just like the organization is. And you've got to be honest and check in with yourself in terms of would you really want to be working in a role and with an organization that, if you don't fit into a certain box, then maybe they're not as interested. How would that show up going to work every day? How would your fulfillment be with that? So it's a lot of questions that, we can't answer for you. These are things you have to self-reflect on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I think we can turn this so much more into a mind game. So this is probably a good opportunity to just kind of stop and say, if you're here with us and you're listening and you're thinking, okay, well, this is another thing I've got to overcome in the middle of, um, the way we think about things will inevitably influence our behavior, whether through micro behaviors or through decisions we've made or through the attitudes that we come to. And this could be good attitude, because there are good attitudes. It's not like a tude, like an attitude, but the micro behaviors that we have, the perspective with which we see the world, if we're looking for negativity, we're going to find it. And so this is one of those places where it would be helpful. And I'm saying this to myself because this happens with all of us, but I know I've been in that situation where I'm like, well, it's just another test for me to take, right? And so this is a good opportunity to say, okay, what is my brand? What do I want my brand to be? And is there something that I feel like potentially could be working against me? In every downturn, there's an opportunity. So that is something to look at and to figure out what is the opportunity and how can we reframe it? Because just as much as employers going to be using, psychological assessments, there are plenty of psychological strategies and persuasion and communication ways that you can help to frame and to communicate and convey your value. And all the time, and Portia, I know that you do this a lot as well, is taking something that feels like a red flag, but really making it the thing that actually gets you hired. And it's very, very possible. So definitely stay on the positive side of things. Now, Portia, before we start to wrap up here, I'm just curious because I know that if you're listening, you're curious about this too. Are there questions that a candidate can ask a recruiter or hiring manager about how the Hogan will be used in the process? Or is this a conversation that ever happens?
It depends. I tend to see that, like in that example I mentioned earlier with that client, if you're applying for a role that is generally like with a really large corporation, you can tell it's volume-based hiring. They probably just have hundreds, if not thousands, of customer support reps. You might not get the opportunity to ask questions. It might be literally you apply and then a couple of hours or a couple of days later, you get this link, hey, take this assessment. You don't even have a point of contact. Unfortunately, in some of those instances, you really can't have that dialogue. And well, I should say it's not presented for you to have that dialogue. You have to do a lot of more research and investigation to try to find a point of contact because there isn't one provided to you. But you can doing a lot of research. But I find that if it's just a volume-based job, generally that flexibility isn't there. Now, if it is a role where you can actually speak to a person, right? You're in the interviewing process. So by that, generally when people make it to the interview, they're usually somewhere in the top 8 to 10 candidates for a role, depending on the organization. And then there's more leeway, there's more flexibility, and everyone's process is different. And you made a great point. Some organizations put this assessment on the front end and some put it on the back end. I tend to find that for the more specialized and executive roles, it's usually towards the end. And if that's the case, then you can usually ask more questions about, hey, tell me more about how this interviewing process, works at your organization. I'd just love to find out more about the steps and so that I can prepare myself,
Yeah.
for the process. And if you hear about an assessment, then that's a great way to ask more follow-up questions in terms of, what can you share about this assessment with candidates to help them throughout this process, right?
Mhm.
That is, I think, a good open-ended question. You don't want to seem like, hey, tell me the answers to the test. Right? So you don't want to kind of give that energy, but you can ask. I generally say open-ended questions.
Oh, that's a great way to phrase it. That's a great way to phrase it. Thank you for sharing that. Along with that, if somebody knows that they're taking a Hogan, is there anything that they should do ahead of time to just come in more authentically, more grounded, or is there any prep that you think is necessary?
Honestly, I think that the prep is to not take an assessment when you're stressed, when you're super busy. Sometimes people, they have a lot going on. They're applying for a lot of jobs, and it's like, oh, it's the end of the day. It's 5 o'clock. I've maybe been working all day if they're in a current job or taking care of family members. Let me just crank out this assessment. Do not do that. I really think that you should take the assessment at a time when your mind is clear, when you're not stressed. Maybe that's in the morning for you. Maybe that's whenever you get a break during the day. But I don't think that an assessment is something that you should just cram in. I think that if there is any preparation for the assessment, sometimes companies provide more prep on the front end than other companies. Sometimes you just literally get a link, take this assessment, it's 30 minutes. But other times they will provide more information about the assessment. And if you have that information, then you can do some research if you want, or you can just use that for reflection. But I think my number one tip is don't cram it in. Don't just force it
Mhm.
into your schedule at all.
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. Because if you notice, when we're stressed, we make different decisions. We go back to the micro decisions, the behaviors, right? We tend to be more, imagine you're stressed, if you're tired, if you're hungry, all of those things lead us to be wherever we are on the scale of skepticism versus openness. We
Yeah.
tend to lean more skepticism, skeptic. We tend to lean a little bit more into the negative side because, again, you're hungry. Like you need to go get a Snickers. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So totally understand that. All right, last question here, but then I'd love to learn just a little bit more about you. But this last question is, let's say I take a Hogan assessment, I get hired, and I'm a curious person. How likely is it, or how would I go about saying, hey, I'd love to learn more about my own growth and development? can I see the results of the Hogan assessment and or build a development plan around it?
I think how you phrase that is perfect. I think it depends on the organization. So some organizations are very siloed. So recruiting and talent acquisition, they own all of this and they don't really speak to your manager or whatever department, operations, client services, sales, whatever functional department you're in. But yeah, I mean, I love the way that you just asked that, Patricia. I would, go to the recruiting contact as opposed to your management contact and ask that question in terms of if you could get access to those results that you took in the pre-hire assessment, you'd love to use them for development purposes, perhaps to develop as a leader or whatever aspects you want to work on. I think that's a great way to frame it. You definitely would want to add in a bit about using it for professional development purposes.
Absolutely. I like that. I like that. Okay. Wonderful. Well, I know that as we've been having this conversation, I know if you're listening, you're like, okay, I've got to get a hold of Porschia. Let me find her content. Where do I find her podcast? So, can you tell us a little bit about who you help, what you do best, and how we can find you?
Yes. So I like to say that we help ambitious professionals and seasoned executives. I think some of the core challenges that they're having when they start working with us, one, they might be trying to land their dream job. Another one is maybe they want to get noticed for their next promotion. They feel like they've been overlooked and they really want to grow in their current organization. And then the third one is to develop their leadership skills. So maybe they are leading a team and they really want to improve the results and the performance of their team, or maybe they see themselves as a leader and they want to develop those skills so that, they can really move into management or leadership roles. So I think those are some of the key areas that we help our clients with. If you've enjoyed this conversation and you like those kind of topics, the Career 101 podcast is the podcast where we share all of our insights. Patricia was kind enough to come on the show, and her episode will be airing in the coming months. So we talk about what I like to say, everything you were never taught or told about career growth, development, and change. I'm sure you see this too, Patricia, but I think with careers, it's really one of the only areas in life where there is no playbook. Most people do not have a career development class where they sit down and learn how to navigate their career, how to manage their career. Everyone's winging it. If you're fortunate enough to go to a university that has a career development department, did you ever go? I went to a large university, never went. And then even if you do go, I have a lot of contacts in career development in universities. They can give students, I should say, a 20-minute time slot, right? And how much is going to get solved there? So people are graduating from school or just entering the workforce, and no one has a playbook for this. And it's not just young professionals, right? It's people who've been in their career 10, 20, 30 years and now need to make a shift. So that's why I'm really passionate about what I do and what's on the podcast. You can find me on Fly. So that's FLY high, HIGH, coaching.com. That's our website. So we have a lot of really helpful and influential information up there with the blog. We've got a podcast, all of that.
Awesome. I love that there's resources that they can go and learn more about you, learn more about your services, and also reach out to you when they're ready for coaching. So
Yes, thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for hanging out with us today. And if you're listening right now, thank you so much for being here with us. We hope this conversation on the Hogan assessment and just this hiring and selection process has been helpful for you. I know that you'll have questions, so reach out to Porschia and Fly High Coaching. And if you have any questions, feel free, as always, to reach out to me here on LinkedIn. But know that no matter what, we are cheering you on. We're praying for you, and we'll see you on the next one. Hey, thanks for listening. I really appreciate you spending time with me today. If you found this episode helpful, please tap the 5-star review on the show's homepage in your podcast app. It would absolutely make my day, and it helps others discover the Uncommon Career Podcast. Now, to download your free career resources and learn how I help seasoned professionals land amazing offers in as little as 90 days, click on the link in the description or go to theuncommoncareer.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next one.